I'm Joshua Bardwell, and this is the Foxeer Legend 3. It's Foxeer's new action camera, and today we're going to find out how it stacks up against the GoPro Hero5 Session, and also we're going to see how it stacks up against the Hero4 Session, which some people would say is a more fair comparison since they come in at almost the same price point. Stay tuned. We're really spoiled for choice today in the action camera world. You name any price point down to maybe even as low as 60 or 70 bucks, and you can find a pretty decent action camera that'll do the job. And it's really just a question of how much you want to spend and what features you're going to get at that price point. The Foxeer Legend 3, which is the camera we're looking at today, comes in around 150 bucks. And if we compare that to, well, the GoPro Hero5 Session comes in at 300 bucks, and the RunCam 3 comes in around 99 bucks. Now, those cameras don't stack up exactly the same in terms of their features. For example, the RunCam 3 doesn't shoot 4K video, whereas the Foxeer Legend 3 does, and of course the GoPro Hero5 Session does as well. Now, how much does that matter to you? Well, when we looked at the 4K video coming out of the GoPro, we found that it actually looked kind of worse than the 2.7K video, at least for fast motion. So you got to ask yourself how much you care about these features and how much you're willing to pay for them. And what I'm going to do in this video is break down the features of this camera, show you how it stacks up against the Hero5 Session, and so with some flight footage, and help you make your mind as to whether 150 bucks for this one is the sweet spot for you in terms of price versus performance. You can see, first of all, yes, it is not the cube form factor of a GoPro Hero5 Session or Hero4 Session. And well, given what happened to the RunCam, with GoPro and RunCam having to take the RunCam 3 off the market, at least temporarily, maybe that's a good thing. Those of you who are a fan of the Mobius shape of camera are going to love this. This is very similar to it. It is smaller than the original Legend, which I always thought was a little bit too long to easily fit on the top plate of a copter. This one, especially if you get just a little bit of up tilt on it, doesn't take up a lot of space on your top deck. As far as durability goes, I mean, the build quality feels really solid, and you can see I've got a little nick here. I have had it banged around on my copter a little bit, and so far it shows no signs of damage. Of course, only time will tell just how well it holds up to the kind of abuse we put these cameras through. People are very big fans of the GoPro Hero 5, and one reason is that they say it holds up to damage really well. No camera is indestructible, of course. We've all seen videos of heroes with their front lens smashed and all kinds of stuff, so it's hard to judge, but it feels solid anyway for now, so there's that. It does have a door that comes off here on the back, and it's got a removable battery, and that's where the SD card is going to go. I will say, you would think that the removable door in some way would help the SD card stay in, and in fact we've got a little rubbery thing here to help press against it, but in the crashes that I had one particular crash. I actually had the camera taped onto the top of the copter with electrical tape because I didn't have a proper mount for it, and I only had one strip of electrical tape holding it on, and it went flying in a crash. Not a particularly bad crash, and the card got unseated. So yeah, maybe I just got unlucky, but it doesn't bode well for the card staying seated extra well in crashes. So again, just a sample size of one, but there you go. Of course, we've got USB and the HDMI out here, and that's really nice that it has a proper mini or micro HDMI out. You don't have to do a USB adapter or anything like that. On the left side, we got a button here, and that turns it on. On the right side, we got a button here that starts recording. One small complaint I have about the camera is that it's really easy to accidentally push those buttons while you're handling the camera. If you're pressing it into a 3D printed mount or something on your copter, it's really easy to start the recording by accident when you didn't mean to. If I turn the camera on, which I'll do by holding down this button, there we go, you'll see another nice thing about this is that it has an LCD screen, like a proper full LCD screen. In fact, I dare say it's got more information on the LCD screen than the Hero5 Session. Now, the Hero5 Session does a great job of making the most out of its little single line screen, but it doesn't show you all this stuff at a glance. And I really like being able at the field to look and just confirm that the resolution and the frame rate that I'm choosing are correct. The exposure of my camera is not actually letting you see the screen. Hold on, let me adjust that. So you can see we've got the resolution. It's indicating no SD card here. Wi-Fi is on. We've got the state of charge on the battery. We've got a clock. We've got a timer mode, everything you could want to know. And in addition to that, you can actually, we change to photo mode, then we change to menu mode, and I press this button on the right side. We can actually go in and we can change the resolution. We can change all the settings. In fact, lots of the settings. Frankly, almost too many of the settings. It's almost a little annoying to have to go through all these if all you want to do is change the resolution or something and you missed that one. But you can change just about all of the settings you could possibly want to change, even if you're in the field, and that's nice. Now there is, of course, an Android app and I presume an iPhone app, although I don't have an iPhone, so I haven't verified that personally. So of course you can attach this via Wi-Fi and configure it that way. But if you want to configure it really quickly with the buttons, you certainly can. Now we're going to take a look at the specs of the Foxeer Legend 3, and we're going to compare it to the GoPro Hero5 Session, and we're also going to compare it to the GoPro Hero4 Session. And here's why I've picked those two cameras. The Hero5 Session is, well, it's kind of like just the top of the market. If you had all the money in the world to spend, you would just buy that one and you wouldn't even think twice about the competition. That's not like an insult against these other cameras. It's just that, you know, GoPro is a premium product at a premium price, and there's not a lot to dislike about it. It doesn't have a removable battery, okay? There you go. So we're going to compare and we're going to see how the Legend 3 stacks up against basically the top of the line benchmark and see how close it gets. And since it's half the price, saying that it's maybe not quite as good, well, if it's more than half as good, it may be a pretty good value for you. We're also going to compare to the Hero 4 Session, and the reason for that is that the Hero 4 Session has recently been marked down by GoPro. You can get a GoPro refurb Hero 4 Session for about the same price as the Legend 3. And so then that raises the interesting question, would you rather have a second-rate GoPro compared to a top-of-the-line Foxeer? You know, how does that stack up? So let's take a look at the specs. And the first spec we're going to look at is the aspect ratio or resolution that the cameras support. Now I've got this graphic from GoPro and it is all the resolution supported by the GoPro Hero5 Session. And we can see that each of these resolutions has either a 16:9 aspect ratio, which is a standard widescreen aspect ratio. That's resolutions like 4K or 2.7K or 1080p or 720p. Or they have a 4:3 aspect ratio, which is the old aspect ratio that your television used to have back before we had widescreen televisions. And you might ask yourself, why are we still using 4:3 resolutions in this day and age when widescreen is pretty much the standard? And the answer to that is this. The sensor in the camera is a 4:3 sensor. And I don't know all of the reasons for that, but one of the reasons that somebody once pointed out to me was if you take a circle, which the lens casts a circular image. Yeah, right. The lens is a circle and the image cast by the lens is a circle. If you then draw something inside the circle, like a rectangle, the rectangle that takes up the most of the circle will be a square. Okay. So a more square, less rectangular sensor captures more of the image that's being cast by the lens. And maybe that is why manufacturers build 4:3 sensors. Maybe there's another reason, I don't know. But anyway, the sensor in the camera is 4:3. And so the thinking goes, well, as long as you've got a 4:3 sensor in there, no sense just throwing out pixels. And in fact, that's what the camera does when you set it to a 16:9 resolution. Well, let's dig into a little deeper into that. When a camera records at a 16:9 resolution, generally what it does is it just chops off the top and bottom of the sensor image. So, for example, here is a 2.7K 4:3 image. That is native sensor size or sensor aspect ratio. And if you want to get a 2.7K image out of it, the GoPro simply slices off the top and bottom of the image and throws it out. That's it. And so you're losing pixels, you're losing resolution. And there certainly is an argument to be said. Some people say, well, I'm going to shoot in 2.7K 4:3, and then I'm going to manually crop the image. And that'll let me get a little bit finer control over how the image is framed. Maybe I want to chop the bottom of the image off and not the top. Anyway, so that's what some people prefer to do. The other thing you can do if you so desire is you can record in a 4:3 resolution and then stretch the image to make a wider screen image. So we could record, for example, in 1440p, which is a 4:3 resolution, and then we could just manually stretch that out to get a 2.7K widescreen image. Obviously, the image would be distorted, but perhaps that's something that you'd prefer to do. GoPro came up with a clever thing called SuperView, and the goal of SuperView is to give you the full field of view and resolution of the 4:3 image sensor while still giving you the 16:9 widescreen image that most people expect to see on their nice fancy television. And what they do is they shoot the 4:3 image so you get the full vertical field of view. The top and bottom of the image are not chopped off, and then they stretch the image, but they stretch it in a clever way. They leave the center of the image untouched, and they stretch the edge of the image only. So the idea there, I guess, is that, you're sort of going to get some distortion from the fisheye effect of the lens anyway, so maybe people won't notice quite as much as you're whizzing down the mountain, drinking a Mountain Dew, that as the trees by you, that they distort a little bit, right? And so a lot of people like SuperView for FPV because you can see the full top and bottom of the image, you get more ground in the image. It's whizzing by below you. It looks like you're closer to the ground. It looks like you're going faster, to tell you the truth. If you think about a really, really zoomed telephoto lens, something way off in the distance coming at you looks like it's moving really slow. Whereas if you think about it like a really wide angle fisheye, everything looks like it's whizzing past. So SuperView gives you a little bit of that, and many people like to fly FPV in SuperView. So for me, at least, the ability of the camera to support SuperView is kind of a big deal. I like it, and I would choose a camera with SuperView over a camera that didn't have SuperView. You might say, well, can't you just do that in post-processing? Well, not exactly. It's very easy to take a square image, a 4:3 image, and stretch it to 16:9. That's a piece of cake. But then the center of the image is also stretched as well, and that doesn't look as good. I've tried and tried to find a Premiere plugin that will let me do a SuperView like a dynamic stretch where I stretch only the edges, and I simply can't find one. I think there's one that exists, but it's only supported on Mac, and I don't have a Mac. Everything that I've found says that if you want to do that kind of thing, you have to have After Effects, and that's a little bit further than I'm willing to go. So if you have After Effects already and you want to shoot in 4:3 and then manually create a SuperView-like effect, then you can. But for most people who don't have access to these tools, it's just not possible. So here we've got the Legend 3 up against the Hero5 Session. And this is not a complete list of the resolutions that they support. I've tried to pick out the most interesting resolutions and frame rates because the full list is really, really long. And I will start down here at the bottom with 1080p 30. 1080p 30 SuperView. And the Legend 3 supports a SuperView. They don't call it SuperView because copyright or whatever, trademark, but it's a SuperView-like thing that does, well, basically the same thing. We can see that the Legend 3 records 1080p 30 SuperView at 16 megabits per second, whereas the Hero5 Session records the same thing at 45 megabits per second. That's a pretty big freaking deal. From my GoPro testing, I found that at 1080p 60, I didn't think that the resolution was optimal, and I felt like the bitrate, it could have been even a little higher. And so, yeah, so 16 megabits per second, I would just say that's not, I don't feel like that's enough. You can take a look when we get to the videos and you can decide for yourself, of course. 1080p 60 SuperView on the Legend at 30 megabits per second. Now we're starting to get there. You might say, well, it's 60 frames per second. It's twice the number of megabits per second. So isn't it essentially the same? Isn't that still inadequate? And I would say, I mean, obviously you'd always like more bits per second if you can get them, but because each frame has similar information to the previous frame, doubling the frame rate of a good encoding doesn't necessarily mean that you need double the bit rate to get the same quality. Again, we can look at the footage and decide for yourself. But the Hero5 Session still beats it, 1080p 60 SuperView at 45 megabits per second. The next one we're going to look at is 1080p at high frame rate. High frame rate is useful. I don't think high frame rate is so useful for playback. I do think that 60 frame per second playback looks better, at least for FPV video, than 30 frame per second playback. But when you get into the range of 90 or 120 frame per second playback, I think that's more the realm of if you want to do slow-mo stuff. If you shoot at a higher frame rate, you can then go slow-mo and still have a decent frame rate. For example, at 120 frames per second, if you went to 25% speed, you would still have a resulting 30 frames per second, which your video would still look reasonably smooth. So this is a little bit of a of a filmmaker's trick, but since they both have it, let's look at it. We got 1080p 120 frames per second on the Legend 3 in 16:9 resolution. It can't do SuperView at 53 megabits per second, and 1080p 90 for the Hero 5 Session, 16:9 wide frame, no SuperView, at 60 megabits per second. So these are pretty comparable. Pretty comparable, I would say. The Legend 3 does have the higher frame rate, so it's going to be able to do a little more slow-mo tricks if you're into that than the GoPro. The next resolution is a little bit of an oddball. What we've got here for the Legend 3 is 2560 by 1440. And what this is the highest resolution that the Legend 3 will do 60 frames per second at. So if you're trying to shoot FPV and you want that 60 frame per second smooth playback, then this is going to be the highest resolution you can do it at. 2560 by 1440, notice that it will not do the SuperView. It'll only do regular 16:9 widescreen, and the bitrate is only 37 megabits per second. For the Hero 5 Session, the highest resolution that it'll do 60 frames per second at is 1920 by 1440, which is a 4:3 resolution at 60 megabits per second. So much higher bit rate here. And by the way, we can see for the Hero 5 Session, we're just at 60 megabits per second for all the higher bit rates. But we can't do widescreen here, and we can't do SuperView. You could certainly stretch it or crop it yourself, but you would be working with fewer pixels at the end of the day than the Legend 3. And then we cross over to the 2.7K resolution. So the Legend 3 will do 2.7K at 30 frames per second, SuperView at a bitrate of 31 megabits per second. The Hero 5 Session is almost directly comparable to that, but it has almost twice the bitrate, just about twice the bitrate. The Hero 5 Session also has a 2.7K 48 frame per second mode without SuperView, so maybe that one is actually more comparable. I don't know. It's at 60 megabit per second again, and I don't use this one very much. I don't like 48 frames per second as a bit rate. I think most viewers are going to be watching in either 30 or 60 frames per second. I guess they could watch in 48. I just don't feel like 48 gives you that really smooth effect like 60 does. I don't feel like 48 is actually that much better looking than 30, and I'd rather have 30 with SuperView than 48 with widescreen. That's just me. Maybe you feel differently. And then we come to the 4K resolutions. Now the Legend 3 will do 4K at 25 frames per second SuperView, whereas the GoPro will not do SuperView at any 4K frame rate or any resolution. The GoPro will do 4K 30 frames per second in widescreen 16:9, and the Legend will do 4K 30 frames per second in widescreen 16:9, and they both use 60 megabits per second here. Having said all that, how would I sum this up? Well, I think the Legend 3 clearly wins at the 4K resolutions, at least on paper. The bitrate is comparable to the GoPro, but it has more versatility. You can do SuperView at 25 frames per second, whereas you just can't do SuperView at all on the GoPro. But on the other hand, I'm not sure how much I care about that, because in my GoPro testing, I found that 60 megabits per second was just not enough bitrate for 4K resolution when we were doing fast motion like FPV. And I will be interested to find out if the Legend has the same issue, or if the Legend pulls a rabbit out of its hat and makes 4K resolution look good at 60 megabits per second. My gut feeling is that it won't, and that 60 megabits per second just isn't enough for 4K. So personally, my inclination is to discount 4K on both of these cameras because the bitrate's not high enough. We'll look at the footage and we'll see if that turns out to be true. At the 2.7K, I feel like the Hero 5 Session wins because the specs are pretty comparable in terms of resolution and frame rate and SuperView, but the Hero 5 Session is throwing twice as many bits per second at it. And, you know, SD cards are pretty cheap. I don't mind. I'd rather record at 60 megabits per second than 30 megabits per second. We'll look at the footage, and you can see if you feel like those extra bits are making a difference. Down in the 1080p range, that's a tough one. 1080p 60, the GoPro wins in terms of bitrate, and 1080p 30, the GoPro definitely wins in terms of bitrate. So I feel like the GoPro wins here. I feel like the GoPro is going to be having better looking images, at least on paper. I should say before we move on, you're not going to find these bit rates, these Legend 3 bit rates anywhere on the internet. I couldn't find them, and I had to ask my rep at Foxeer to tell me what they were, and they thankfully sent me a Excel spreadsheet with this data in it. So if you're wondering where I got those numbers, that's where I got them from. And if you actually record some footage from your Legend 3 and look at the bit rate, you'll find that it varies and may not hit these numbers exactly, but these are the targets that they use. Came straight from Foxeer. In terms of the Hero 5 Session bit rates, the Hero 5 Session sometimes will use different bit rates if you have ProTune turned off. So this assumes that you have ProTune turned on, so it's using the maximum possible bitrate. What about the Hero4 Session? How does it stack up? Well, I'm including it because it's priced at $140 refurbished from GoPro right now, and I'd take that in a heartbeat. I wouldn't worry about the fact, oh, it's refurbished. Well, if GoPro puts their name behind it, I'll take it. So it's priced basically the same as the Legend 3. And if you look at the resolution specs on paper, I think it loses. The Hero4 Session is worse in most ways. The bitrate caps at 24 megabits per second, right? So it except down at like 720p, 1080p, 60, yeah. And it has far fewer options in terms of resolutions and so forth. The place where I think the Hero4 Session might pull ahead is it does have certain options. Like, for example, it does have the option to do ProTune flat color for more flexibility in post-processing. I've got a video on what ProTune flat is. If you want to watch it, I'll try to remember to put a link in the upper right-hand corner. The other thing about the GoPro, and I'm not going to spoil anything by telling you this, is that the mics on the GoPro are vastly superior to the mics on any other camera I've seen. I don't know what kind of magic GoPro is doing in their digital signal processing, but they do such a good job of killing the wind noise. And the Legend 3 is not bad. You'll hear for yourself in just a minute. But the sessions are just so much better. And I haven't actually flown a Hero4 Session, but all I know is lots of pros flew with the Hero 4. And when the Hero 5 came out, many people said they felt like that the Hero 5 had worse audio than the Hero 4. And the Hero 5 is pretty freaking good audio compared to everything else on the market. So, yeah, so I guess if you're not interested in 2.7K and you feel like 24 megabits per second is enough for you, then maybe the Hero4 Session is your pick over the Legend 3. But in many ways, the Legend 3, I think, beats the Hero4 Session, at least on paper. And that's going to bring us to the end of this video. And I know you want to see me fly the freaking camera instead of freaking talk about it. Yeah, I know. That's coming tomorrow. So little YouTube teaser here. I apologize. I hope you'll forgive me. But I got like 45 minutes of content. I'm not kidding. And there's just no freaking way I could release that as one video. The real question that I am going to answer tomorrow is, we've looked at all these ways in which the specs of the Legend are better or worse than the specs of the other camera, the Hero5 Session. But how does that actually manifest? What's it doing with its 30 megabits per second, 1080p, 60? That doesn't mean that it's worse than the GoPro necessarily. Maybe it's doing something special with the encoder and it's doing better. Yeah, well, so you're going to have to stay tuned tomorrow to find out for yourself whether that's true. Hint, hint. You'll see. All right, thanks for watching. Happy flying.